Hey everybody, Brad Geiger here with another episode of Webcomics Confidential, and today I'd like to talk about discoverability. In other words, how do you build an audience? It's a problem that's really at the center of what we do as web creators and as independent cartoonists, and it deserves a pretty thorough discussion. So that's what I wanted to devote today to. Let's start here. Patreon, for example, is not a place to build an audience. You'll see a lot of creators complaining, Patreon doesn't bring me backers. I can't get backers. I can't get people to find me on Patreon. You see this from a lot of my friends in the Not Safe for Work community because NSFW creators are not included on Patreon's search function. And they say, this is stopping me from growing. This is a horrible thing. I can't be discovered on Patreon. By the way, you'll often see people blame discoverability issues on a failed Kickstarter. They'll say, oh, Kickstarter didn't bring me enough people. Kickstarter didn't expose enough new people to my work. That is looking at discoverability exactly wrong, in my opinion. Okay? Discoverability is not a crowdfunding issue. Discoverability is actually something you have to really understand well before you can excel at crowdfunding. Remember, that's Geigers Law of crowdfunding. First comes the crowd, then comes the funding. All right? If you haven't built an audience, you can't expect crowdfunding. You can't expect Patreon to bring you patrons. Instead, Patreon is a place that you bring an existing audience in order to monetize them. Okay? You can't expect it to go the other way around. Remember, if you're ever confused about it, it's right there in the word. First comes the crowd, then comes the funding. That's why they call it crowdfunding. Okay? So, with that out of the way, let's talk about a few ways that we can actually look at building an audience. Let's look at the way that discoverability works for us. So back in the early days of webcomics, I remember pulling aside Robert Koo. Robert was the business manager for Penny Arcade. He was the model of success for webcomics at the time. He was the person with the knowledge. He was the man with the plan, right? And I remember going to Robert and I was saying, I really think that if I could get more eyes on my comic, I would be more successful. How do I get more eyes on my comic? I think if I could expose my comic to a bigger group of people, I could do better. Does this sound familiar to anybody? I think it's pretty common to all of us in webcomics. If only I could get my comic in front of more eyeballs. And Koo looked at me and very dispassionately, and he said, you have exactly the readership you deserve. Man, and by the way, talk about a person that was very good at cutting right to the heart of the matter. Pissed me off, but he was absolutely right. He was absolutely right. It made me angry because I wanted the answer to be a one weird SEO trip, right? I wanted it to be something about search engine optimization. I wanted it to be about a magic hashtag. I wanted it to be about a secret handshake that I hadn't learned yet, a button that I could push. And what he was saying was that it's all about the quality of your comic. And looking back on my stuff, I can see now with perspective something I couldn't see then, and that is my quality wasn't there yet. I had a lot more work to do. And the readership that I had gained was exactly the readership that I deserved at that point. It's a hard fact to come around to, but it's absolutely accurate. You have the readership you deserve. And that's why I always say it's impossible to hide good work on the web, because at the end of the day, it's all about quality, right? And so today, my discoverability mindset is more factored along a simple equation, and that is audience equals quality plus smart publishing. In other words, if you're doing a high quality piece of work on the web, whether it's a comic or anything else. This goes beyond comics. But if you're doing a high quality piece of art, if you're doing a high quality content, and if you're smart about your publishing, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, then you're going to have a high audience. You're going to build readership. You're going to have discoverability. That's how you manufacture discoverability. Quality plus smart publishing. Now, the quality part is up to you. I can't help you with the quality part. The quality part comes with practice and continually looking at your stuff with a critical eye, getting some feedback from some people whose opinions are backed by intelligence and experience, and applying even when they give you very difficult advice, like you got the readership you deserve. Even when they give you advice that's difficult to take, applying that and growing and doing better over time. Quality is up to you. I can't help you with quality. Quality is something that you've got to do day after day after day, and honestly, year after year after year. It's something that's going to come as a result of a long time. There's no shortcuts to quality, okay? But assuming that you're working on quality, and I'm sure you are, we all are, right? Depending on where we are in our lives, we may be in the very early stages, or we may be people that have been working on this for a long time. Wherever you are on the quality spectrum, I'm going to assume you, like me, are constantly trying to get better. There's nothing I can do about that. But let's talk about smart publishing, because there are some things I can put in the back of your mind that you can have in place as your quality continues to improve. First of all, let's talk about your website. I'm still very in favor of having your own website because, just as we've seen recently with Tumblr, if you don't own your own place on the web, some other entity's decisions can completely pull the rug out from you. And we've seen it enough time over the 20 plus year history of the web that we know that it can happen. That's why I always like to have my own place on the web where I can set up what I need to set up without worrying about somebody else's decisions tomorrow completely thwarting what I've built. Okay, so number one, I do still strongly suggest that you have a place on the web that you can call your own. And when you're taking a look at that website, when you're taking a look at your web publishing effort, you have got to make sure that it's responsive. And what that means is when somebody is looking at that site from a mobile device, it's got to give them a mobile-friendly version of the site. That is something that maybe 1% of webcomics is doing right now. And I count myself among the 90% that are flat-footed on this to some degree. Mobile doesn't mean necessarily that you can see the site on a mobile phone, right? And that if you pinch and zoom, you can read it with enough work. You can get through there and get through the panels. No, it means that when they come to the site, they can easily read your stuff. That means maybe a panel by panel vertical scroll, similar to what you get through Webtoons. That means that they, or maybe a side-by-side horizontal scroll, similar to the multi-image posting available on Instagram. One way or another, that comic has to be easily read on a mobile device. Take a look, and if you don't believe me, take a look at your own analytics. It will bear out that a higher and higher number of people are looking at the web through their phones, not through large desktop computers. The future is mobile devices, not desktop. And that's where your audience is going to be. And if they can't read you, then they're not going to read you. That's another one of Geigers' laws, although it's usually applied to lettering. If somebody can't read your comic, they're not going to read your comic. You've got to make sure that you are prepared for the mobile, smaller screen future of webcomics. And that's scary for a lot of us. Believe me, it's scary for me. It's something I'm still working on. Here's a few things you can do in the meantime. Number one, I've already mentioned Webtoons. You can mirror your comic on Webtoons. I do, and I strongly suggest it. And I make it very well known to my readers and to my backers that if they'd like a mobile-friendly viewing experience, Webtoons is one place that they can easily get that until I get it figured out on my own site, right? Social media publishing is also a way that you can be very mobile phone friendly in your publishing. But that means you have to make a few accommodations that not many of us are making, and that's actually my number 2 point. You need to be posting your comics on social media so I can read them legibly and easily. Now let's break that down. You need to be posting your comics on social media, not a link to your comic, not a link to another social media site. I see this on Twitter all the time where it says something that I'm very interested in, and it says, hey, take a look at this sketch I made of Superman. And then it's an Instagram link, and they expect me to go from Twitter to Instagram to see this thing. And by the way, I'm not going to do that. And 90% of you people reading that social media tweet are not going to do that. All right? Nobody's going to go from one place to another. Social media audiences are very sticky. Now, back in the day, 10 years ago, it was okay to post a link on social media because 10 years ago, we were all making advertising money. And it was important to send that social media user to your website so that you could monetize that traffic. That was a very important reason that we did things the way we did them back then. There's very few people making money through ad revenue today. It's mostly crowdfunding. And as a result, the impetus, the reasoning to send traffic back to your website is gone. You want them to read the comic where they are without having to leave. That means posting that comic legibly on that social media. Not a link to someplace else, not go over here and look at this other thing. You've got to post it right there so they can read it. Now, why do I keep saying legibly? Because so many times I see people posting an entire page of comics on Instagram. Instagram is 1080 by 1080 pixels. There's no way your page of comics is legible on Instagram. It's just not. And the fact that Instagram supports multi-panel posting, where you can go panel by panels, by a sideways swipe, a horizontal swipe. The fact that you can do multi-panel posting on Instagram makes it absolutely ignorant to post an entire page of comics on Instagram because it's not legible. And that really is Geiger's rule of typography. If they can't read your comic, they're not going to read your comic. And that type is too small to read when you're posting an entire page of comics on Instagram. Come on, get with the program. You can do a panel by panel swipe. You should be doing a panel by panel swipe on Instagram, okay? And Twitter and Facebook, you get a pass because when you click on something on Twitter or Facebook, it will show you a much larger image. As long as you're posting something at a high enough resolution, I think it's around 1200 pixels wide. If you're doing that, you can get by with posting your page or maybe even a half page on Twitter or Facebook, okay? That you get a little bit of a pass, especially since Twitter and Facebook both tend to have a little bit of a limit and not good presentation in terms of how they handle multi-image posts. So you get a pass on Twitter, but you don't get a pass on Twitter if you're posting a link to Instagram. That's still dumb. That's fruitless. You're wasting your time. Okay, so posting legibly on social media is my number 2 point. Number 3. Follow the 3 C's of social media. All right? It's the key to building an audience on social media and thereby building an audience for your comic. The 3 C's of social media are content, commercial, and curation. If you are offering your social media backers a good mix of the 3 C's, you're going to generate a following on social media. Content, that's your original content. That's your comic when you post it there legibly so I can read it, as well as your thoughts about the day's events and so on and so forth. That's all content. Commercial, you have to use that sparingly. All right, and be wise in how you do it. Nobody wants to see a post that's just an ad, okay? giving them, there's lots of ways that you can do this in a very savvy way. You can post them a sample. Hey, this is something that I'm doing at Patreon. You can post a snippet or something to read the rest. You can see this. There's a lot of ways that you can handle commercialization in a savvy way. Just an ad that says, go support me on Patreon, nobody wants that. Nobody wants that in their social media. But if any commercialization you do attempt needs to be mitigated. It needs to be the smallest of the 3 C's. All right. But keep in mind, don't go too far the other way. A lot of people say, I don't want to do any ads. I don't want to do any commercialization on my social media. People don't want that. If they're getting heavy amounts of content and curation, they're not going to mind the commercial. All right. That's why it's the 3 C's. You've got to have all 3 of them. So content is your content. Commercialization, that's when you're pointing people towards things like Patreon and Kickstarter, a new book that's coming out, et cetera, where they can find your stuff on Amazon. That's commercialization. And then there's curation, the thing that we web cartoonists do the worst. That's when you're sharing other people's stuff. We cartoonists, in fact, all creative people, do social media poorly because we think it's all got to be original content. It's all got to be my stuff because I'm a creator and I've got to create and people expect me to create. And wait a minute, social media is about the things that you're creating. It's also about the stuff that you're sharing. That's why they call it social media. That's why I think so many of us are so bad at it. We cartoonists tend to be kind of insular. We don't tend to be very social people. We don't do social media well as a result because we keep screwing up the social part. The social part is where you're sharing other people's stuff on your social media and saying why you're sharing it. I like this, you might want to say. Or here's something that I really think is interesting. Or look at the way this person wrote this joke. Or look at the way that she's drawing trees. Share your joy in someone else's work. That's curation. And it's powerful. And by the way, you're building a social network when you do that because you bet your bottom dollar when you're sharing other people's work, they're taking note of it and they're going to be more apt to share your work, right? That's social. That's the social part that we all miss in social media. Curation, sharing other people's work. The 3 C's are going to help you build your social media following. And finally, number 4, understand the social media community that you're posting in. Remember at the very top of the show, I was saying that I wanted Koo's answer to be like a magic hashtag. I wanted him to tell me that it was something that I just had to use. In fact, we see this at Comic Lab all the time. People ask us a question, what hashtags should I use? Well, how do I use hashtags? Hashtags are really a great example of what I talk about when I say understand the norms of the community that you're posting in. Because to ask somebody which hashtags should I use is kind of a dumb question, okay? Because the answer is different for every community you're posting in. Facebook is very down on hashtags. I see a lot of evidence that Facebook is throttling posts that have hashtags. You don't want a lot of hashtags on Facebook. Okay, they don't like it. On the other hand, Twitter will allow 1 or 2 hashtags, or I should say, the Twitter community will allow a few hashtags without getting too grouchy with you, without being upset. They'll allow hashtags. That's not a problem, okay? On Instagram, hashtags are really important because you can't share as much on Instagram. It's much more difficult to share on Instagram. As a result, you have to use hashtags, but you have to be smart in how you use them. If you have a bank of hashtags that you use over and over and over again, you're going to be identified from a lot of the stuff that I'm reading. You might be identified as a spammer by Instagram, and they might start to throttle your posts. That's really dangerous. Using the same hashtags over and over and over again makes you look like a spammer. You don't want that. You don't want to get throttled. So take some time, do a little research, do a little bit of reading, watch a few people who do some YouTube videos that talk about some of this stuff. Understand the social media community that you're posting in. That'll give you a lot of information on things like what hashtag should I use, and when should I post, and how should I post, and how often should I post. Understand the social media community that you're posting in, and you will do a lot better at generating your own discoverability. Remember, discoverability, the building of an audience, is your responsibility. And it's something that's going to come as a function of the quality of what you're doing, plus the smartness, the thought that you're putting into your web publishing efforts. This is Brad Geiger once again for Webcomics Confidential. Let me know what you think down at the comments below, and I hope you have a creative day. Bye now.